Chapter 1. Cora Anderson sat at the large table in Veltec's dimly lit conference room and watched a presentation covering the expanse of the social media campaign she and her partner Ruby Crosby took part in 9 short months ago. As one of the USA's beach volleyball twosomes, they used the newest and latest phones from Veltec, one of the largest smartphone companies in the world, and carried them to Rio, where they took pictures, filmed short videos, and hosted live feeds. They had coordinated the campaign with the new version of the phones that hit the market 2 days after opening ceremonies. The campaign, a brainchild of Cora's mother, Maxine, and the advertising department of Veltec, turned Cora and Ruby into darlings of the world. The viewing numbers during the Olympics broke records, and the endorsements that came after overwhelmed them. They were known as the Jewels of America, Ruby and Jade. Cora's nickname, given to her by her father when she was still a baby after he caught her chewing on a jade chess piece in his office. He saw how close her eyes resembled the color of the stone and never called her Cora again. He often remarked that her eye color was the perfect blend of his ice blue eyes and her mother's emerald green eyes. She watched the screen as she and Ruby battled against Spain. Cora stood 2 inches taller than Ruby's 6-foot frame, and her Native American heritage darkened her skin in the summer sun, several shades darker than Ruby's Northern European skin tone. They had refused the skimpy bikini-style uniforms popular today and wore a more traditional indoor volleyball uniform with tight spandex shorts and tank tops. That also created a storm of support and criticism from the world, which caused more people to watch, which just increased the viewing numbers. All in all, Veltec considered the campaign a major success. As Cora watched the presentation, she felt very proud of the contribution she and Ruby made to the campaign. No one anticipated the massive response the consuming public would have. Maxine guessed that Cora and Ruby had something very special about them that drew the public to them in a way that social media encouraged. During competitions, the closeness the 2 women shared as friends and sisters in Christ created teamwork that made them move like a single unit, and they became a force to be reckoned with. If Cora hadn't wrenched her knee in the final match, they likely would have won the gold medals. Instead, they earned the silver. The presentation on the screen showed a sampling of all the different times they used social media and highlighted the phones. It ended with a graph visualizing the climbing popularity and ratings until anything they sent out had millions of views and tens of thousands of comments. Cora remained in awe at the level of success of the campaign and how, nearly a year later, they still rode the social media high. At the end of the presentation, the screen silently rolled up, and the room gradually grew brighter. The lead ad executive, Marvin Collins, stood at the head of the table. "Jade, Ruby, we are thrilled with the success of this campaign. We'd like to do it again." Ruby said, "It's another 3 years before the 2020 games. Shouldn't we wait?" "True, for the summer games." He gestured with his hand, and Cora took note of the man sitting to his right. The man had oriental features, complete with straight black hair, dark brown eyes, and tan skin. He had very broad shoulders and sat tall and straight on just the edge of his chair. She estimated he stood at least 6 feet tall. He wore a blue button-down dress shirt that stretched across his wide chest and a thick smartwatch that would have looked too big for most men, but fit him perfectly. "Ladies, I'd like you to meet Dauntless Davis Elliott. Davis is the #1 favorite to make Team USA's hockey team. He has agreed to be part of our upcoming Winter Games campaign that will start next week and build for the next several months until the closing ceremonies in Pyeongtaek, Korea." Cora narrowed her eyes at him. She recognized him but couldn't quite place him. When he turned to face them fully, she saw her school's emblem on his shirt and suddenly realized that he attended her school in Virginia. How did she know him? Classes together? Maybe she'd seen him at the gym. Then she remembered, and her face darkened. Last week, Davis Elliott and several hockey teammates made newspaper headlines because of a drunken brawl in a bar near campus. The newspaper slammed the hockey team as a whole for ending the school year on such a note. Davis Elliott's face had been clearly visible in the photo published on the front page of the paper. Ruby lifted her hand in greeting to Davis, and he nodded his head with a brief grin. Cora simply looked back at Marvin and asked, "Why start now? It's May. It's a long time until the February games." Davis answered, "It's my schedule. We're gearing up for training camps and tryouts. In June, I'll be mostly unavailable, and then in September the team will go to our training facility in Tampa. The training schedule is going to seriously inhibit a lot of free time." "Right," Marvin agreed with a nod. "We need to get the relationship established now, so when the holiday campaigns really pick up speed, the public will buy it." "Relationship?" Ruby asked, her eyebrows lowering. Marvin nodded. "We added a twist to this campaign while riding on the coattails of your success. Believe it or not, the first hockey game for Team USA will be on Valentine's Day. Since the games will be in Korea, and Davis is a Korean American, our focus groups really responded to the idea of a flirty romance between Davis and one of you. Nothing real, of course. The romantic match will be purely for marketing. The public can even be in on the game, kind of a wink-wink, nudge-nudge. We think the world will love it." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Love it and buy your new phones." Having taken part in such a successful social media campaign, Cora actually admired the cleverness of the idea. However, she could only do that by removing herself from the equation. Could she possibly do something like this and get away with it? Did she want to? Marvin's mouth crooked up in a slight smile. "Well, of course. And our other products, too. This is the intent of marketing, is it not?" He looked at the piece of paper in front of him, then back to the two girls. "Our team has built profiles for Davis and concluded that Ruby is the best match for him." Ruby let out a single burst of a laugh and covered her mouth to stifle another. She took a breath and announced, "Well, Marvin, I think that's for sure a swing and a miss." Marvin met her eyes. "What do you mean?" Through her smile, Ruby explained, "Oh, nothing against Dauntless over there, but did your team pay attention to the fact that I'm engaged? The announcement was made last week." Marvin opened his mouth and closed it again. Finally he said, "No, actually. That certainly—" His voice trailed off. Cora shifted in her seat, feeling like the entire table suddenly turned to look at her. Her cheeks grew warm as she considered the offer. It would only help her own popularity grow. Thinking about the endorsement contracts her attorney father still fielded on her behalf really made her think seriously about it. To buy some time, she said, "Well, I'm single." It helped. Everyone politely chuckled. Cora's gaze darted between Marvin, Ruby, and Davis. No one spoke, and she felt the tension slowly mounting again. "So could I possibly have more than 15 seconds to make this decision?" she asked before they could even inquire if she'd be willing to play the part. Marvin nodded and cleared his throat. "Please understand that this is a very time-sensitive situation, so I'm willing to excuse you from the room, even to maybe go take lunch and come back. But we'd need to know before you leave the building today. We have other Olympic stars we need to reach out to if you are unable or unwilling to do this." He tapped a piece of paper on the table. "Obviously, our preference is one of you, which is why we brought this to you first. We've already established your brand with a successful audience, and we'd rather not lose the momentum." Cora met Davis's stare. She wondered what went through his mind because she got no reading from him at all. She could see the image of his face plastered all over the stories about the controversial brawl. Should she do this? What damage would it do to her reputation if she chose to partner with him in this venture? Would her moral stance be strong enough to counter his bad boy reputation? Deciding to step forward in faith and hopefully enjoy a few more months of the spotlight, she nodded. "You know what? I don't need more time. I'll do it." A couple of people around the table clapped, and Marvin let out a breath he'd obviously been holding. As he sat down, the attorney at the table pulled out a thick stack of contracts and took the floor. An assistant placed a stapled stack of papers in front of her, and the attorney said, "If everyone can look at page 1. Cora interrupted him. "Excuse me, has Daddy reviewed this?" Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Davis look down the table at her. Was that a scowl? She briefly met his eyes and saw the question in them. She owed him no explanation and didn't bother acknowledging. Instead, she looked at Marvin as he answered. "Anderson and Associates prepared them. I've just texted my secretary to have her contact them and make sure he knows that you're the one signing it." Barry Anderson had represented all the Vescoli companies since day one, including Veltec. Decades earlier, years before he married Cora's mother, Her father had bankrolled a professional football career into a successful law practice with Viscoli Enterprises as his most important client. Of course, the Andersons and the Viscolis had more than business in common. Her father had married Tony Viscoli's sister-in-law. In a way, every Veltec employee ultimately answered to Cora's Uncle Tony. Cora nodded, knowing that Veltec knew her and her father well enough not to play any games with the forms. She glanced at Davis again and saw him raise an eyebrow, though he did not speak. Was that a smirk, or was it a scowl? Was it nothing at all? She couldn't tell. February and the end of this contract suddenly felt centuries away. Over an hour later, Davis Elliott stood up from the conference table and approached Cora and Ruby. He remembered watching them play in the Olympics and followed their social media campaign, not understanding as a viewer the level of behind-the-scenes orchestration that had created it. When Veltec approached him last week about this new campaign, he jumped at the opportunity, knowing it would only help him in the future. He would never admit how disappointed he'd felt at the idea of being paired with Ruby instead of Cora. He'd felt more drawn to Cora while watching them play. Maybe it was because she went to school with him, or maybe he simply found her attractive. Either way, while Cora considered the contract, he'd held his breath, quietly rooting for her to agree to it. The concept, even in pretense, of having a close relationship with her for the next 8 months, of actually getting to know her, whether the romance was real or not, appealed to him. He didn't think he'd have any trouble pretending to feel enamored of her. When he got to their side of the room, he extended his hand to Ruby. "Davis," he said, "nice to meet you in person. Congratulations on your engagement." "Thank you," Ruby said, her face lighting up with a radiant smile. He turned to Cora, realizing she stood taller than him by a good 2 inches. "Jade, thank you for agreeing to this. I think it might be fun." "It's harder than it looks." She put her hand in his, but did not return his smile. "I attend Virginia, too. I think that could help sell the romance angle." "I know who you are." She pulled her hand from his and turned to Marvin. "I'm assuming you have phones for us." Davis had no trouble reading her dislike, but wondered at the source. They'd never met, and as far as he knew, had no mutual friends. Maybe she just needed time to get to know him. Marvin clapped and smiled from ear to ear. "We have phones for both of you. Follow me." He walked next to Cora through the conference room door and down the hallway to Marvin's office. The assistant's desk by the door sat empty, and Davis realized that it was well into the lunch hour. Marvin let Davis and Cora precede him into the office, then stood by the door. Davis could smell spices and meat and noticed the aluminum pans on a covered table against the wall. "If you give me your personal phones unlocked, we'll get everything transferred to the new ones. As you know, this is the upcoming technology, so please guard them well. We wouldn't want them to get into the hands of our competitors before the release date. That will coincide with Black Friday shopping. I know we just went over this, but I'll reiterate that if you lose them, please call the hotline as soon as possible." Marvin gestured at the sitting area. "Please make yourselves at home, and take some time to get to know each other before we launch the campaign. I've had lunch from a local Mediterranean restaurant brought in. Help yourselves. I'll be back in about 45 minutes. As he shut the door behind him, Davis stuck his hands in the pockets of his slacks. He suddenly felt nervous and unsure of himself. To cover, he smiled at Cora. "So, I know we go to the same school. What is your major?" "Pre-law. I want to eventually be a sports agent." She walked over to the food and picked up a paper plate. Inspecting the food in front of her rather than looking at him, she asked, "You?" If she actually sounded interested, he might have elaborated. "International business." He followed her lead and loaded a plate with grilled lamb, saffron rice, pita bread, hummus, and salad. She sat in a chair and immediately bowed her head, obviously blessing the food. He thought it might have been nice for her to have waited for him, but did not say anything. Instead, he silently blessed his own food and refused to react. As soon as she raised her head, he picked up his fork. "So, I know you agreed to do this, and we just signed a mountain of paperwork, but I'm starting to get a sense that you don't really want to." Her eyes widened, obviously surprised at his directness. "Why would you think that?" He thought he accomplished quite a bit of restraint when he didn't laugh out loud. Instead, he took a bite of rice to give himself time to formulate his response. "Because you're not shy or uncomfortable, which was my first excuse for your attitude. Instead, you're clearly hostile. So I'm curious. We've never met before, have we?" Are you implying that you wouldn't remember if we'd met? He gritted his teeth and smiled, annoyed and slightly angry. Nice non-answer. That's twice I've asked you direct questions, and you've answered with questions. He nodded. She opened her mouth to say something, but he held up a hand. Know what? Never mind. They ate in silence for about 5 minutes before she spoke again. Okay, here it is. She straightened her spine and met his eyes. I'm trying to decide if I really should have allowed myself to be drawn into a fake romantic match with someone with your reputation, that's all. I'm sorry, my reputation? Of everything she could have said, that was not what he expected. Yes, your reputation. She stared at him as if the conclusion she had reached concerning his character should be self-evident. As in your picture, plastered all over social media and the local news during a drunken brawl at that dive near campus last week? She set her plate down. I would think that an athlete seeking a place on the Olympic team would have been less inclined to act that way. Less inclined? His jaw dropped open, appalled at her conclusions. Do you even know what you're talking about? He remembered the incident, of course. A group of guys from the hockey team had gone to a local pub to celebrate the end of finals. Things had gotten out of hand. A friend had texted him, the captain of the team, to come help break everything up. By the time Davis arrived, a full-on brawl had already ensued. He and a couple other sober-minded men had dragged teammates away one at a time and eventually broke it up. A few of them ended up in jail that night. He remembered his picture in the paper, but it never occurred to him that someone would think he had contributed to the problem instead of the solution. In fact, the article itself commended him and his friends for stepping in and breaking it up before things got even worse. I think you know what I mean. I don't think I need to explain it. She haughtily raised her chin as she settled back into the chair and crossed her long legs. As she looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. But we can probably still make it work. I don't think it will damage my reputation too much. I think that if we're careful... Hang on. Your reputation? Davis's temper started to boil as he cut her off. He really couldn't reconcile the wholesome girl-next-door silver medalist he'd seen on countless television interviews and internet videos with this judgmental shrew. Well, now I'm having second thoughts. I'm beginning to wonder if I should have allowed myself to be paired up with a self-righteous know-it-all with the social graces of a shark. While I'm down in Tampa, we'll need to make sure to visit SeaWorld so you can swim with some of your own kind. He surged to his feet and tossed his paper plate into the open paper bag sitting on the table next to the aluminum pans. Clenching his hands into fists, he stormed to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn of the office park. All of his excitement at this venture fizzled out, and irritation replaced it, making his neck muscles tighten painfully. Cora did not follow him, nor did she speak again. For the next 15 minutes, he stayed completely still, trying very hard to cool the haze of red temper he started to see in his peripheral vision. He clenched his teeth hard and took long, deep breaths through his nose, praying silently for control. On the ice, he embraced his temper and let it feed his sport, his position as team captain and head enforcer. All of the players on his team knew that Davis had their backs. The opposing teams gave dauntless Davis a wide berth. They knew Davis would make them pay dearly if they took a cheap shot at any of his teammates. He would home in on his target with uncanny focus. At impact, he would inflict pain in astonishing ways. The most intimidating thing about Davis is that he never, ever let anything stop him. Instead, he used everything to his advantage. His pads were his armor. His skates were his swords. His stick was a deadly club. In the rink, everyone recognized Davis as a warrior first and a hockey player second, even though he was an exceptional and gifted hockey player. Though he had lost nearly as many games as he had won in his lifetime, he had also tossed the gloves off more times than he could count. In all those years, in all those games, no one had ever gotten the better of him during those violent seconds before he entered the penalty box. All he had to do was turn his mind off, lose all conscious control, and let his body become a 225-pound, 6-foot-tall missile racing over the ice at 30 miles per hour. Off the ice, he never ever wanted to lose control like that. He had only one time in his life, back in 6th grade, when Andrew Marsoni had pulled the sides of his eyes tight and mocked his mother's Korean accent. Davis had snapped and hurt Andrew. Bad. It had taken 2 adult teachers to pull him off the boy, and words about charges and a lawsuit were bandied about for a few days. After that, his Special Forces father began counseling him into channeling his rage through his hockey stick. He couldn't believe he had let a spoiled, entitled rich girl's ignorant remarks spur him into an emotional response. Obviously, he had built her up in his imagination, made her into something more than she truly was. He couldn't blame her for being herself. He had only himself to blame for his lofty, false expectations and subsequent disappointment. Gradually, the anger he felt toward Cora Anderson dissipated, and only a mild irritation remained. Feeling safe, he turned and looked at her. She sat sideways in the chair, using her drawn-up legs as a prop for her notebook. She frowned as she focused on whatever she crafted. He could see her pencil moving up and down as she drew broad strokes. She didn't look up until he moved forward. Quickly closing the cover of the notebook, she tossed it and the pencil into her bag and straightened in the chair. "Davis, I'd like to apologize." "Don't bother. I'm okay with the pretense. I'll smile pretty for the camera with the best of them. But I get it. We aren't friends. And we don't need to be friends or even talk when the cameras are off. We can be fake friends." She opened her mouth as if to argue, but then closed it, nodded stiffly, and said, "Fine." "Yeah, it is fine," he nodded. "Not sure I could be real friends with someone like you anyway." "Someone like me?" "Right." He nodded again. "Fake." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean by that?" He shrugged one shoulder slightly. "You're absolutely nothing like you make yourself out to be online. You're fake. Makes me think you should be great at teaching me to be fake, like you." He walked out of the conference room and made his way to the elevators.